How many people have ever gone to like an open source project somewhere and they go to the landing page and they read the whole landing page and then they ask that question? Okay, that's what I'm here to try and hopefully fix. It's all about how to make your open source documentation not suck. So if you're working on an open source project, your documentation is going to make or break your project. And I want to hope that it's the former and not the latter. So I learned this by working on the hybrid cloud science data system at JPL. They went open source in 2017, and it had formerly been a private project before that. And so a lot of the documentation was very thorough for the technical side, but wasn't really geared toward an open source audience. And me and Kate were brought in as interns to kind of fix that. So what is HySDS? The hybrid cloud science data system is used to process all kinds of different scientific data into useful information. So one of the common ways they do that is with radar data. So you know, the Ridgecrest quake that happened a couple of years ago, ARIA, which is a project at JPL, was able to send a satellite over Ridgecrest and compare it to a scan that they had done about 3 months prior to that. And using the radar data, they're able to make an interferogram and see where the actual surface deformations are in the ground. They can use that for disaster response or research or whatever else needs to be done with that information. It was done through HySDS. So it's modular, it's versatile, it's can be configured to do any kind of processing that you need it to do. So for data scientists, we've got a view here. They can, there's all kinds of different variables that can change around to kind of make the data fit what they need it to do. And then for developers, it's a little more complicated. So this is the kind of stuff that we were confronted with right off the bat. And it's maybe not as friendly for some guy on the internet to run into. If you're a developer at JPL or you've been a long-time programmer, you can probably make sense of this. But I mean, we had like 60-page software design documents and all kinds of stuff. So that's kind of what it looks like for developers. Goals for the project: pathfinding. We don't want to get too crazy into it. We're part-time interns. We're only going to be there max 16 hours a week. You got to understand that we aren't going to be full-time. It's 16 weeks. We're not going to understand HySDS at the end of it totally. We're not there to write code. It takes them a lot of time to even onboard their own people, so we're not here to like completely understand the project. We're here to poke holes in the documentation and see what's missing. So got to keep it reasonable. First stage was research. So we went to write the docs. They're an open source community that is all about documentation and how to actually write good technical documentation. We went to other projects from JPL like OpenMCT and Cumulus, which are you know, have really good websites, really good documentation. So we kind of see what JPL already does with their documentation and try and follow in those footsteps. And then finally, we were doing a Confluence wiki, which is how we were going to actually host all the documentation. So we had to figure out how to use Confluence. We went to wiki to figure out how to use a wiki and what's expected for a wiki, what you're supposed to find. We had a bit of work cut out for us. So Kate actually went and mapped the entire wiki as it existed. So she actually did this all by hand, which is a little crazy. And we just visually mapped out how the wiki actually looks and how everything is organized to begin with. So what are we actually working with here? We were working on design, approachability, navigation, organization, maintainability, and consolidation. All of our documentation was spread over 3 different sources. We had a Confluence wiki, we had an internal wiki at JPL, and then we had another website that was hosted on GitHub. So there was no one place to actually find like an authoritative source on HySDS. sort of, it was kind of up to the developers to like know what's current and what's not. The whole internal wiki is about twice the size of the public wiki because there's a bunch of projects that are developed for JPL and weren't public, still aren't. So there's a ton of stuff on there that never made it onto the public wiki and probably won't. And then you had this whole other GitHub website that had a bunch more documentation. It had some of the same documentation, it had new documentation, there's just nowhere to really go. We tried to think about information access, converting users into contributors, into authors. So you should be thinking about when you're writing your documentation how to make it as easy as possible for someone to figure out what your project is and then transition to actually using the project and then transition to actually contributing to the project and writing their own documentation. There's a cycle there that's clear with every project, and you should be thinking about that when you're writing your documentation. Approachability was something that I personally worked on a lot. So if we actually go over to the wiki, this homepage, this landing page was kind of my baby. I spent a lot of time going over what was already there, not understanding it, asking lots of stupid questions, and then once I sort of wrapped my head around what HySDS is, writing my own layman's version of what HySDS is and trying to explain that to people. The part that I didn't realize was I got like 3/4 into the internship and finally actually showed that landing page to somebody else and they didn't understand. So none of that really, I got all the way into that and realized that I was sort of not headed in the wrong direction, but I needed more. And that's why I included the real world example here, which is the Ridge Quest quake that we had talked about. Including an actual example of what your project does, even if it's something like HySDS where there's tons of different versions of what it does. If you have just one concrete example of here's something we did with this project, that can help people really understand where you're coming from. It's even better if they can run it. So if you've got a simple guide, even if it's not necessarily the quote-unquote real thing and it's more of a simulation of what the thing actually does, if someone can actually run your program or run your project or solve a problem with it, that's going to help people understand a lot. HySDS is not super applicable to that. It's difficult because the whole point of HySDS is that it runs in the cloud. So unless you're familiar with AWS or you have money to spend on AWS, you can't really take full potential of HySDS. But there's versions of it that you can like run on your own laptop. And that was a big thing that we were pushing. Let me get back to my slides. People are always looking for FAQs, guides, and getting started. That was what we figured out was we started to get the wiki together and then we started handing it off to people. And the first thing that they would do after reading the landing page is look for an FAQ, look for a getting started, and look for guides. That's expected for any and every open source project. So if you're missing those, start writing them. Even if you start a project, start writing those immediately. If you've got somebody else that you're showing to your project, have them start a Google Doc and write down questions as they come to mind. That was something we started doing a lot is other people would start onboarding onto the project and we would literally tell them, write a Google Doc and every time you have a question, write it down. And once we had 2 or 3 people together, we could start seeing which questions everybody's writing down and start forming an FAQ based on that. So you should be writing that kind of stuff from the get-go to any project. Even if you never think it's going to see the light of day, start there. We worked a lot on navigation, and as you can see, it kind of, we started out with what we already had, which is more on the right side here. It ended up kind of splitting into 2 halves of the wiki. There was a half of it that was more for the technical side, and then there was a half of it that was more for visitors and like getting into understanding HySDS. It wasn't something that we planned. It was something that kind of ended up that way. But I think it's a good way to build a wiki for a project. You have your half for new users, and they can sort of go into the rabbit hole that way. And then once they get through that and they start to actually understand, they can start heading over to the more technical side and getting more in-depth. A lot of the stuff that's on that left side is stuff that we either wrote or we told people to write as interns. Again, with the scope of the project, I don't know how to write a contributor guide for HySDS, and I'm not going to know how to write a contributor guide for HySDS. I don't have enough time for that. I don't work with the code, but I know we need a contributor guide. So I need to hand that off to somebody who's equipped to write that. Just knowing that you're missing a certain document is huge. Even if you know you can't write it, that's okay. But if you can hand it off to somebody and at least give them a solid concrete goal, instead of, hey, write documentation, you can say, hey, write this document. That's big. We spent a lot of time in meetings kind of, hey guys, I need a contributor guide, please, and handing that off to somebody. We wanted to highlight the content. So we spent a lot of time taking existing documentation and going, how do I organize this? Where do I put this? Where does it make sense for this to be? And that kind of links back in with how do people navigate the wiki? Where are they going to expect to find certain information? And you need to highlight that information in the places where you're expecting to find it. Whether that's existing stuff or new documentation that you have to write, a lot of the time you might have a couple articles that are already written, and you know there's going to be a couple in-between articles that are going to lead to that information. Maintainability was something that I worked on a lot. So I actually wrote a little to-do page, which should still be live. Here it is. And we came up with a tagging system for HySDS. We had 6 tags, which are delete, create content, unfinished, in progress, needs update, and OK. Every single article on the wiki should be tagged with one of these 6 tags. So obviously delete means I think this needs to go away. I'm not totally sure that it needs to go away, but I'm going to tag it delete, and someone who knows more than me can take a look at it and say, you know what, this is old, or we don't need this anymore, we'll get rid of it. Obviously, if you know it's not good, just delete it. But if you're not sure, tag it. Create content means that the page is, we know the page needs to be there, but it's missing content entirely. It's either a stub article or it's just said, I just made a contributor guide article, but there's nothing actually there. I'm going to tag it create content. Unfinished means that it has content, but it's not considered functional. So there's something there, but it's still not quite enough for anyone to actually use it. In progress means that the article is functional, but it needs some work. Needs update means that this article might be out of date, and no one's looked at it in 3 years, and there's been a lot of development that happened, so someone should probably look at this, make sure everything here actually still works. And OK means it's good. You're good. Then I started working with some of the tools in Confluence to actually keep track of all these articles. So I went and manually tagged every single article in the wiki. And if you actually change the tags on any of the articles, they will update here as you go. So this is somewhere that the developers can go and immediately figure out what articles are where, just based on where they are. And then once they update the tag, it automatically updates for them on this page. So that saves a little bit of time. I also ended up just putting some top priority articles here. So these are things that really are missing a lot of content and we really, really need. Bringing it all together. So these were our 3 sources. So we had the internal wiki on the right there. We had our Confluence wiki, and then we had the depreciated wiki. So this is what the original wiki looked like when we got there. This is where we got by the end of it. And this is what JPL has internally as far as documentation. There's probably 2 big reasons for that. One is that it has to go through a process to be made public, any of that documentation. And 2, it has to actually be useful for the public to see. And a lot of it is really specific adaptations of HySDS for some particular project, and it probably just isn't worth making it public because there's not a whole lot to gain. There's a ton of stuff in there that should probably be public, but again, there's a process. So we got to kind of weigh, does this thing deserve to be on the public wiki, or is it only really useful for the people in those projects? So that's a big part of why the internal wiki is so huge. We went through a lot of time just organizing, removing duplicates, tagging things, getting rid of old stuff, making sure stuff was up to date. That was a lot of our time. It ended up being 330 pages by the end, which is pretty good, I think. This is kind of a visual guide of what makes up the wiki as far as how many articles. So it's mostly guides, tutorials, and how-tos. And a lot of that is because that's the stuff that already existed going in. They had actually written a lot of really good documentation. It was the other stuff that needs a little work. Bringing actual outside contributors in was where we did a lot of our digging. We're still working on that. HySDS isn't easy to understand. It's not the type of thing that you can just bring somebody in on. Going into the project, we were hoping to get the wiki into the place where we could actually solicit outside open source contributors to the project, whether that be university students or other organizations that might be able to benefit from the project. What we realized about halfway in was we didn't actually have enough stuff to onboard our own people, really. So the second half of it ended up kind of transitioning into that, which is just get our own documentation good enough for our own people, and then down the line we can worry about actually soliciting outside contribution. So we got to get a roadmap going, which is something that we were working on with the team. Actually publicly announcing, hey, this is where we're headed with HySDS, here's how you can help out. Bringing in more interns, getting the FAQ page going, getting the contributor guide going. That's all the stuff that we ended up recognizing as top priority, but never having quite enough time to actually get it nailed down. There are interns that have continued on with the rest of this project after me, so they're working on a lot of that stuff. I won't do too much schmoozing, but JPL is pretty rad, and it's the people that make it that way. I spent a lot of time asking stupid questions to really smart people, and they never looked down on me for it. I spent a lot of time walking around campus and meeting people who didn't treat me any different after realizing that I was just an intern from the local community college, and were still just as interested to talk about what I was doing as when they thought I was a full-time employee. It's a very cool place to be. So I do have to thank Landang. She was my staff mentor. She was the one who really made this whole thing happen for me. Without her, none of this would have done anything. I wouldn't have learned any of this stuff. So thanks, Land. Appreciate you. If you want to get a hold of me, spencer.sullivan@gmail.com. Send me an email. Happy to answer any questions. You can also contact Kate. She was my co-intern. She was with me the whole way. She did tons of work on this project that I didn't get to. She's rad. So if you have any other questions, she's another person you can definitely ask. So thank you guys. Any questions?
So I'm sorry if I missed this talk. You said originally when you started you had 3 separate sources of documentation. You had Confluent, internal wiki, and basically like the external documentation.
So he's asking when at the beginning I had mentioned that we had 3 separate sources for the documentation. So those were an internal wiki at JPL, which is on their intranet. So you can actually only get to that if you're at JPL and have credentials. We had the Confluence wiki, which is what we worked on. So that already existed when we got there, and we just reformed it. And then we also had a GitHub Pages website. So that was actually hosted on the GitHub for HySDS. And we ended up basically nuking the GitHub Pages because at the time, we have plans for it in the future, but it ended up just causing more problems than it solved, and just consolidating down to the Confluence wiki and some of the stuff that still exists on the internal wiki. But the developers at JPL should now be contributing full-time to the Confluence wiki. So in a sense, the internal wiki is kind of retired, except for the internal projects that are still going on with that. But anything that's just the general HySDS core, it should all go to the public wiki. So that's the authoritative source.
So you still maintain the internal wiki. That didn't fully make its way into Confluence? Is that?
Yeah, so lots of stuff that was in the internal wiki didn't make it into Confluence, mostly because it was stuff that didn't make a whole lot of sense to be on the public wiki. There's a lot of just really specific adaptations. And that stuff, I believe, is still being maintained by the teams that work on it.
I was asking because we have a similar situation in that we have like an external wiki and we have an internal documentation repository. We've been looking at putting it all in one place, but then limiting based on like access restrictions. Like you have to log in to see this page or that page. And I was wondering if you played around with that in Confluence.
It wasn't something that we played around with Confluence just because the Confluence wiki was meant to be a fully 100% public source of information on HySDS, and they already have this existing internal wiki, so it's kind of anything that they plan on being internal would just go on the internal wiki. But I'm sure there's ways you could do that in Confluence. There's tons of tools that I never got around to using. I'm sure there's ways you could do that. Yeah, it might even be more useful to have a separate source. Like have your Confluence wiki for whatever everyone is going to be able to see, and then if you have some internal stuff that only certain people could see, it goes on like a separate website or some internal resource or something. Anyone else?
If you don't mind me asking, what was the time frame you had for that internship, and did you show up with like a singular objective every day, kind of thinking, this is what we need to get done today, so we can start working on this tomorrow?
Yeah, so he's asking what was the time frame for the internship and what were like the daily goals and things like that, I think, right? So 16 weeks was the total, 4 months. It went along with our semester. It was actually, the internship was done through Pasadena City College. So it was meant to coincide with one semester because I was getting school credit for that. We set the initial goal that someone should be able to stumble upon the wiki and reasonably understand HySDS within 1 week, I believe was the original goal. I don't think we're there yet. That, like I said, that goal kind of shifted halfway into the project. Everybody knows you start a project and you set your goal and then you follow the plan, and then at the end it works, right? And you get your goal and everybody's, yeah, maybe not so much. So the goal kind of shifted as we got into the project. We spent a lot of time sitting in Lan's office and talking about deliverables, and she was with me every step of the way. Lan's office was where we would do our work for the most part, so she was there every day to kind of direct us. So if we have any questions, that's where we would go, and that's where we did kind of our planning. There's definitely some times when me and Kate were a little lost as far as like what direction we should be headed. We had all these problems we needed to fix, but where do we start? And that's kind of where Lan stepped in and was like, hey, do this. And in the end of 2 weeks, you should have this. So we set kind of a general goal and then did some research and then started setting deliverables. That's how it ended up going. Anyone else? All right. If you have any other questions, feel free to talk to me once I'm done here. Thank you.